All right, thank you everyone so much for joining today for our second webinar series in onboarding and scaling CI/CD across teams. We'll just wait a couple minutes for a few more folks to trickle in and then we'll get started. All right, again, for those of you just joining, welcome to webinar number 2 in our series. We're just waiting a couple minutes for a few more attendees trickling in, and then we'll get started in our conversation. We'll give one more minute. The numbers are slowing down and we'll get started in just a second. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. I want to be respectful of everyone's time today. This is webinar number 2 in our 3-part series focused on onboarding and scaling CI and CD across teams. And so we're talking about scaling software delivery pipelines. In today's session number 2, we're really focused on that evaluation and migration stage, right? Do I have a challenge I need to address, and how will I effectively go about evaluating that? And we really want to look at how you can effectively do that while minimizing or managing the risk to your organization. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. There's a little Q&A link down below that any of you can hit. So if you have any questions over the course of the presentation, please go ahead and note them in that panel, along with any slide numbers that are relevant to the conversation. Great. So let's start with the premise of today's conversation. I'm willing to guess that most of you that have been in IT for a couple of years have likely participated in some sort of large-scale migration, right? And I'm not referring to easy and peasy migrations. I'm really talking about these large-scale enterprise impact mission-critical migrations that we hear about, right? These are the ones where we're really banking the business on it. This is going to take a lot of people, it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to have a ripple impact across the entire organization, right? It's going to be hard, it's going to be risky, it's going to be costly. And so we might say that this software migration is a bit like changing the engine on a plane mid-flight. And in fact, I'm willing to guess that many of you have probably uttered these phrases, or if not, you've certainly heard them from your colleagues, right? The idea here is that this function, foundation, platform, service is so critical to our business, it can't stop. We don't have time to land. We got to do this mid-flight. Well, before we jump into our engine teardown today, I just want to share a little bit about myself. My name is Eddie Webanero. I'm the Global Director of Solutions Engineering here at CircleCI, and I'm really excited for today's topic. I have spent over a decade in this space around Agile, CI, CD, and DevOps. I actually hired my first DevOps engineer in 2010. But this is really such an exciting opportunity to dig into today. And just to share a little fun fact, how long I've been in the CI space. My first implementation was with Agitar Cruise Control in 2008. It's still around. You can Google it. I don't recommend using it, but it's out there. I've also included a few of my badges down below for a little credibility, both on the process side. I am ITIL 4 Foundation certified, as well as Safe Agile certified. And on the developer credibility side, I'm an AWS solutions architect. I've got some code in GitHub's Code Vault. And so I hope that we're going to have a really productive conversation today about, bridging this challenge across organizations. So let's jump back into our engine teardown. This is a mission critical thing, right? It is so important to our business. We can't stop, right? The business depends on it. We're going to do it mid-flight. All right. Question for you all. When is the last time that you remember being on a commercial flight and you noticed the team of mechanics out on the wing replacing that engine, right? Never. It doesn't happen, right? And I actually had to do some research, a little bit of Googling and confirm it, but never in the history of aviation has that occurred, right? And the reason it doesn't occur, I think is obvious when we think about it. It's an obscene risk, right? Not to mention, it's actually totally unnecessary. The plane will eventually land, and modern aircrafts have intentional redundancies built in so that it can safely land and the crew can perform that maintenance offline in the hangar when it's safe to do so, right? And the same thing happens in IT. We need to manage the risk and balance the costs and the impact of change with the return on our investment, right? And we'll decide pretty quickly, no, we're not going to replace that engine in midair. That's crazy. Okay, so wait a minute. Some of you are pointing out pretty quickly here that Eddie, continuous integration is nothing like a plane. We can't park our software pipelines in the hangar for a weekend and figure out what's going on, right? These are much more akin to, well, they're pipelines. They're like roadways. They're like waterways, right? This is something where value, widgets, traffic needs to keep flowing, and we just can't park it for a couple of days, right? So if it's not like an airplane, what is it more akin to? Again, I think roadways and waterways are great examples here. Not some small town back-end road, though. Let's think about, in the United States, this would be something like I-95, right? A main artery of traffic. We can't shut it down. Traffic's got to keep flowing over that artery the entire time. So how do we manage these real-world scenarios? The answer is still redundancy. In these situations, it's not pre-built intentional redundancy beforehand, but it is in these scenarios where traffic, widgets, value needs to flow uninterrupted. Structures of limited capacity, right, and with an intentionally short lifespan are put in place sort of next to these existing systems, right? And in this way, the widgets, the water, the value, the traffic can continue flowing, although via a rerouted path while they work, repair, replace the existing structure. This image on the screen here is actually doing that. They're doing some road construction, and as part of that, need to tear up the main water pipeline for the city. Well, they can't turn off water for an entire city, so what they do is they just route that water through a fire hose from fire hydrant to fire hydrant. Now, because it's going through fire hoses and fire hydrants, it's no longer potable, but that water is still flowing to all the communities, and they can still, through boiling that water, take showers, drink water, and do all the things they need to do. And so this is the way in the physical world of infrastructure they accomplish these challenges. Now, if we think about this again, back in the lens of enterprise software, the point is it's not easy, right? In these real world scenarios or in the enterprise world of software, it's not easy. These temporary bridges, these redundant structures, they're going to be expensive. It's going to take us time and energy to reinvest our people and reroute traffic. And also, caveat, roads are not software. And so there's always going to be these little nuances we need to deal with. That's what I want to cover in the next 20 or 30 minutes with you all, is really dive into how do we understand if I have an opportunity in my software delivery space at all. If I think I have an opportunity there, how would I go about defining a meaningful evaluation to understand if I can actually, move my organization forward and address some of these challenges? And if I decide that's what I want to do, how do I do it safely, right, without trying to repair the engine in midair? Before we jump into the tooling conversation and proof of concepts, proof of technologies, evaluating new tools, I have to start with the classic DevOps disclaimer. It's not about tooling, right? And it's a really critical foundation to base our conversation on, because in the absence of any other change, i.e. process and culture, the best tooling in the world is not going to solve your problems, right? However, for a realm and a domain where tools don't matter, we sure have a lot of them, don't we? So without process change, good tooling, and there's plenty of it, it gets ignored, it gets misused, or it gets abused. And I think, in fact, that is why we have such a proliferation of tools, is that teams are quickly moving on, not because the tools were inadequate, but because the culture, the process didn't support appropriate use of those tools. So when thinking about this potential change for our organization, I'm really going to emphasize the fact that knowledge and desire are probably the two most important things that we're going to factor on, because this is, at the end of the day, is change management, right? And just to kind of put a fine point in the idea of, tooling versus culture, My early days of continuous integration were using Subversion VCS with Subversion hooks, calling a bunch of custom shell scripts that use a Linux mail client. There was no user interface except for emails that had big red letters yelling at you when something went wrong. But guess what? It worked. Tests were executed, bad code got stopped, and bad deployments were shipped to customers less often. And what's important is the team saw the value in that. They understood how it worked. There was the knowledge, and they believed it was useful to them. There was the desire. And so even though it was rudimentary and crude, that system got used, it got invested, it got developed on, and ultimately turned into the enterprise platforms that I mentioned earlier in my experience. So the tooling is not the place to start, right? But at some point, like this team did with their Subversion clients and webhooks and all that, said maybe there is an opportunity in the tooling space here, right? And that's great. And you want to pursue that. And we'll take a deeper dive in webinar 3, really looking at day 2 operations and kind of how you manage ongoing exploration in this 1+ model. We have a tool today and we're pursuing something new on the horizon. But we want to do that thoughtfully because we want to avoid tool sprawl. What we don't do, and this is where it applies to the POC, is send a bunch of teams off evaluating their own choice and try and then bring them back and make a decision. That's never going to work out well. We got to create alignment at the beginning, but not consensus. Drive forward a very clear process that all stakeholders are involved in, right? And in doing so, we're prioritizing knowledge and desire because process change, culture change, and even tooling change will come with that. So when we're thinking about those things, knowledge, does my organization understand this? Why they need to change and how it's going to impact them? Is it intuitive to their needs? Does my organization want this? Do they want to use this, right? Does it actually make their lives easier, right? That's the knowledge and desire we're going to be focusing on. Being open in this is really important. We can't do secretive POCs. Don't expect your organization to adopt a tool they've never heard of. That doesn't mean we need a full alignment, but we got to make sure we're exposing folks. And we'll dive deeper into that. The other major no-no outside of avoiding secretive POCs is trying to reverse engineer your current solution, right? Setting goals against your current standard, or even trying to look at some incremental change over current requirements, a 5%, a 10% gain, is not really where we're going to achieve the monumental impact that we need. And in fact, trying to focus on something where the change doesn't really convey that desire to our audience, we're not going to see the wide-scale adoption that we want. And just a point on reverse engineering, because we see this a lot. Hey, I have it today in system X, Y, and Z. Can we just move that over to your platform because we're pursuing, cost or whatever motivation is doing this? And generally, the answer from my team will be no. Although we could recreate the exact same process somewhere else, we don't want to because there's very little value in that, right? It's a great way to spend a lot of money to end up where you are today. Instead, let's really think about how we're going to change. How are we going to move the organization forward in a meaningful way, not rebuild the same existing solutions and their problems in a different platform. Okay, so I kind of railed on what to avoid in a POC. We don't want to be secretive. We want to make sure we're being really careful about what we're outlining as requirements there and not reverse engineering it. It's also really important that we continue to focus on engagement. And the way that we achieve engagement, even if the goal is cost setting, which is sometimes appropriate in software delivery, we still need to make sure that we're engaging employees. And that means aligning to organizational objectives. So even in the case of cost cutting, really focusing on, well, it's about shifting our investments to where we can have the highest return. And employees get that. And they would rather those cost cuttings come in tools than salaries, right? We need to make sure employees understand the change. The knowledge needs to be there from the beginning, tying to the organizational goals today, where we want to be tomorrow, right? When you have professional workers, software developers, operators, administrators, they are professionals, and this excites them, this motivates them, right? We're identifying a better place. We're not going to continue on the same state. We got to get better. And ultimately, we want to focus on how this will impact the daily lives of our end users. And the most impactful way we do that is with friction. And so we're going to look at some of the ways we can identify the friction that we're going to incorporate into a good proof of technology. Ultimately, when we look at this correctly, what we're achieving is a leap forward. We're avoiding incremental change, we're avoiding a lift and shift, and we're really focusing on a monumental leap forward. And so you say, that sounds nice, Eddie, but it's a lot of platitudes, right? How do you actually do that? Here's the good news. You're not alone. This is where your vendor really needs to step up. No POC looks the same. You can't download a cookie cutter recipe off the internet and run an effective evaluation for your organization. So a good vendor is really going to help you challenge your thinking, your assumptions, help you identify new opportunities in your organization, and ultimately embolden your strategy, right? We want to pull in key leaders across the organization, as well as a few of our key developers, and make sure that we're really creating this aligned vision. What we're not going out and doing is generating a requirements checklist from all these stakeholders and promising a system that would deliver all of that. We're building interest and information at this point, not delivering commitment. We ultimately take all the information that we gathered and we do want to distill it down into some goals for the POC or the proof of technology to focus on. Ultimately, I commonly see these kind of funnel down into three main areas. That's cost, speed, and functionality. And that's fine. As long as when we're thinking about costs, we're thinking about real costs, the total economic impact of these activities, not just the licensing or compute costs, but where else that's offsetting activities or opportunity costs in my organization. And we want to make sure we're considering that total cost, right? Speed, it's really important. I've mentioned this a few times, but it's not the reason to migrate. CircleCI is the fastest CI platform on the planet, but coming to my team with, hey, we want to be 5 minutes faster in step B is not a compelling reason to migrate your entire organization to a new software delivery platform. We really have to take that micro lens of this is slow and think about how it ultimately impacts the end-to-end system and what we're trying to achieve in the end-to-end system. Because maybe this part being slow is okay, because there's still a 2-week review process over here, and that's where we should focus on instead of 5 minutes here. And then lastly, functionality. And so a lot of times we will kind of start a conversation with customers and they have an RFP, a requirements checklist of a few hundred questions. Can the system do X? Can the system do Y? We can tick all those boxes. Most CI/CD providers today can tick all those boxes. It's very commoditized. That is not how we should decide a POC. Because again, most every provider can do those things. The question is, what is the experience going to be like for your teams, users, and operators to achieve that outcome, right? Is the knowledge going to be substantial burden, or is it going to be really intuitive and easy to understand? Is it going to be like fun and interesting that desires high, or is it going to be that like super painful burden that nobody wants to ever touch, right? And those are more important to consider than can it do something, binary. And that's really about employee engagement. When we think about employee engagement, I kind of mentioned this, right? But there's two sides. It's the effort. How hard is it to do it? How close or adjacent is this to my existing knowledge, understanding, competencies? And what is the confidence I get from this platform? At CircleCI, we speak a lot about confidence, the confidence to manage, change, and move fast. But exactly what confidence means to individual personas will vary. And it's important that we understand that across your organization. You need to manage these stakeholders, and your vendor will help you do that. But if we're talking to a developer audience, well, then confidence might be, I want to do what I want to do when I need to do it so that I can deliver my objectives on time, right? And as long as I can do that, I'm confident in the system. A yes is a yes, and I can do what I need. Well, security might look at it completely different and say, well, awesome, they can do what they want. I need to make sure they do what they need to do, right? And that's things like code scanning and penetration testing and all the things that help keep our organization safe and secure. To me, that's confidence, knowing those things are done. Similarly, an auditor, attestation governance teams might look at it and say, well, I want to know who the actor was, why the change occurred, where it was, and what current known state is, right? That would be confidence to me. And so we need to make sure across all these personas we're identifying on top of, the effort to use this system, are we achieving the confidence and the trust for our users? I talked a few times now about toil, right? And so we start with the high-level organizational objectives. We want to make sure this is tied to those 3- and 5-year milestones for the organization so that it has the long-term support. We also want to make sure we understand walking those organizational goals down to how does that impact or how is that achieved on the front lines from every individual employee, right? And if you just think about your own experience, in leadership, the CEO or someone has a great direction that comes down, and on the C-suite, maybe as a CTO or CIO, you're aligning to that and you're communicating that message down to your team, or as a director in middle management, you're hearing that from the C-suite and you're trying to bundle that and package it down to your frontline managers. And at each one of those levels, as it cascades further down the organization, there's this little thought in the back of everyone's head that says, if they only knew what it was going to take to realize that, if they understood what that meant for us on the front lines, this would be different. It would look different. And again, that gets amplified as it goes further down because the folks closest to the work understand the friction it's going to take to achieve that. And that little asterisk in the back of everyone's mind, if they only knew, is exactly what we want to amplify in this conversation. That's the toil that we need to go after, right? It's brittle tasks, it's manual tasks, it's the effort to troubleshoot when things go wrong. What does it mean time to recovery? How long do teams spend just spinning when things go wrong, right? Configurability, how quickly can teams move forward, iterate, deliver value, right? And so these things add up constantly, and those are the things that have the end-to-end system impact. Not just how quick can you do step A in a build, but how quickly are we delivering on end-to-end execution towards those organizational goals? Driving that conversation, identify that friction, and make sure we incorporate that in our POC goals. I mentioned speed before. It is a very real constraint that we see put on POCs. And I just want to make the point that sometimes speed is worth it. This is a correlation that occurs in the real world as well. Generally, faster things cost more money, be it vehicles, transport, waiting lines at the amusement park. Faster things generally cost more money. Sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's not. Again, optimizing 5 minutes here to spend 2 weeks over here, it's not worth that money. Just save that money and reinvest it in personnel and process. How you make those decisions is ultimately transparency. Do your finance teams have that cost transparency? Can they understand where usage is being applied to individual teams, projects, and outcomes? Can they then correlate the savings, the earnings, the opportunity costs, whatever it might be for those projects? What is the ultimate impact to end users? And again, kind of morale, productivity, ultimate business goals. Is that speed ultimately worth it? And do you have a lever to adjust that, right? If sometimes it's worth it and sometimes it's not, do you have that lever to flip back and forth? And can you apply that to the different use cases across your environment, right? Because ultimately, at every step, we got to understand, is this returning on the investment we're making? And the last point I'll say about this is, can we empower users to help make that decision more? A big underlying theme here is empowerment versus alignment, or empowerment versus control. And so the idea is, well, if we can empower our users to understand costs more, maybe they'll control them better, right? If they can see that the 2XL box has this implication versus the small box, and maybe they'll make a better decision. I don't need that horsepower. So we've kind of walked out, how we're going to identify some opportunities in an organization where we might have potential leaps forward. We can now start to talk about a timeline. It's really important we talk about a timeline, and that we establish a realistic timeline with explicit goals and measures that we can hit, right? And your vendor should be helping you drive this and get commitment from your stakeholders, get commitment from your the vendor's own resources, right? You need to make sure you're committing your time to this. Making sure that everyone is ready and present to execute on this POC ensures smooth progress. When you're selecting your stakeholders, I mentioned this a few times, go really wide, pull in all those different teams, adjacent silos, and because where we have those divisions between silos, business units, teams, that's where we're going to find those opportunities for major leaps forward. We want to coordinate with those groups, right? Security, governance, platform teams, enterprise architecture, shared services, whatever it might be. Don't necessarily get a checklist of requirements, but here are the concerns or challenges or pain points, and let's look for opportunities to solve that. We're understanding the concerns, not necessarily committing to solving them. Getting those adjacent concerns from all the teams, we can then keep pulling this down into our individual kind of application teams, the front lines. When we go about kicking off a POC, I will not let customers come in with a simple, single, easy thing to do, right? Let's just pick something easy and make sure it works, and we'll move forward with that. Because your team's jobs are not easy, right? The individual contributor's job is not easy, and that is not representative, and it does not create the confidence that you need or they need to move forward with the tool selection. So where we see the greatest success in a POC is actually to pick two very distinct project types, and you want both of them. And you can have more of each if you want, but at least one of each of these. The one is the dream team, right? So this is kind of in the green box there. These are the team that they might actually get some eye rolls across your organization from some of the old guard when they do their presentations at town halls about how quickly they can move. Because the reality is maybe that team is given a little more latitude or leeway. They tend to get greenfield projects that don't have a lot of the legacy anchors or kind of process that other teams feel like they're beholden to. right? We want to make sure those teams, because they're going to push the envelope and they're going to really show us some awesome possibilities. The second team is equally important. This is the standard. If you look across your entire organization today, the way most of your application teams or end teams operate, we want to pick a representative sample. This is the emblem team, right? This is the team that they're the ones kind of grumbling of like, yeah, well, we do things differently because of this. Why we have more controls, more regulation, whatever it is. This is the way we operate. That's a really important team to get on the POC as well. By capturing both of these teams, we're going to make sure that we have that representative voice across the friction, the toil, the pain of our application team, regardless of where they are at on the maturity or technology stack. And this, again, really helps people kind of see themselves, resonate with it as we roll out. Ultimately, I said we're not going to get a list of requirements from all of our stakeholders, but we do want to have a very clear outcome. Did we win or not? And so it is important we have explicit goals with a binary outcome. So some common goals we'll see a mix of functional and business measures. So sure, can we do functional stuff? We can integrate with X, Y, and Z. Yes, we can achieve that, right? Now, some folks will say, I want to look, I know, Eddie, you're ranting about build times, but I want to make sure we get some build time under a certain window or in some time frame. That's okay. Where my team's really going to press you, though, is to understand where that path falls. Where that activity falls on the critical path, and that it is in fact on the critical path, right? That if we really reduce this time, it's ultimately going to impact the end delivery of value, learning, experimentation, and what that, in this case, 40% marker is meaningful for, right? What does that actually achieve in some sort of outcome that is different than today? Reducing FTE allocation, right? And this is a really important one, is the competitiveness of the market continues to increase. Everyone needs to do more with less. That is it seems to be the never-ending trajectory of our industry. So it's really important we can think about how do we achieve the efficiency, and the best way to do that is moving and reallocating FTE from maintenance activities to net new development, right? Shift from keeping the lights on to R&D. And so we really want to look at how we can do that through our software delivery pipelines and process. And again, handoff between business units is a prime ripe area to look for those opportunities. Mean time to recovery is another one I mentioned, really important. When things go wrong, how quickly can your team identify root cause and actually remediate and undo the damage from that challenge? That's kind of on the functional side. What can it do? We also want to make sure it's desirable to our end users, right? Ultimately, I think for desire, there's a really easy way to go after this. I love the end user satisfaction surveys, or NPS, right? There's lots of ways you can structure those kind of surveys. I highly encourage one question to be included. It's my personal favorite question whenever I'm on a consumer website. Would I recommend this to a colleague, right? If you see on bestbuy.com, would I recommend this to a friend? Yes or no? I paid money for it. I'm using it. Would I also recommend someone else pay money for it, right? That to me is such a strong indicator of value. And I would encourage you to do that on the current system and any future system you're evaluating. All right. Also, let's do fun stuff. Let's do new stuff. Let's do hard stuff, right? So bring on those use cases. And this is where a vendor is really going to help you outline exactly what these use cases are. We're not going to move the same solution to a new provider. There's no value in that from an organizational standpoint, right? Unless we haven't articulated it so far. So we want to focus on where can we identify patterns of consumption that simplify this and create that major leap forward. Some questions you can ask. What is one problem teams haven't been able to solve, or maybe did solve and are just really proud of because it was such a bear to deal with, right? That's a great thing to include. And then that major leap, I'm going to keep harping on this, right? We got to find one major leap that either in itself moves our business forward, or is the foundation or springboard that allows some other activity in our business to take a major leap forward, right? And we're doing that on top of all the basic build, test, and delivery stuff. And in that, mining the end user friction, right? Because that's what's going to create desire for users. What is an example of a major leap? I've talked about it a few times. One example might be, this is a little dated now, but the idea of automated change management, right? In the past, highly manual process of opening change tickets, recording the details, and closing out the change ticket was error prone. It was often delayed, inaccurate, and there was a lot of friction and frustration for application teams, right? With the service integrations out there for service management tools, and with the maturity of software delivery pipelines today, there is no reason that change management should not be automated. fully automated or very close, right? So if you're still an organization struggling with change management, that could be a great opportunity of one of those leap forwards. Now, I've talked a lot about winning over developers. And that theme here really throughout the presentation is this idea of empowerment versus control, right? Or alignment versus autonomy. And so if you're talking to an application team, a developer audience, well-empowered software teams can do pretty much anything, and they love that, right? And that's a really important value and a belief at CircleCI. We believe deeply in empowering application teams to solve whatever they need to solve, right? However, so some other folks in your organization, operators, admins, security teams, they may not see that as such an attractive feature. That developers or application teams can do whatever they want, right? And so this alignment versus autonomy or this idea of empowerment versus control is a very real struggle. And in fact, I would say it's probably the paramount struggle that organizations are dealing with in software delivery today. And the ones who get it right are the teams making that major leap forward. This is the single greatest challenge I see around software delivery today is where do we land on that spectrum, right? Control versus autonomy. And so ultimate risk, right? So the way that teams respond to this when they see increased access and power for application teams, it ultimately usually means more reviews, more manual work, and ultimately more risk to the organization, right? And so that's where that can get pushed back, and we have this little pendulum action kind of swinging back and forth between those extremes. So I want to introduce another potential leap forward in this space. It is a vendor bias. And so I've tried to contain all my vendor bias, just a few slides. You can let me know afterwards how I did on that, right? But I want to extend our roadway metaphor for a minute. If we have roadways and we need to make sure people are behaving appropriately, what do? Well, we introduce driver licenses to make sure they're educated, and we introduce rules like speed limits to make sure everyone's behaving, and we introduce police officers to enforce those rules. That's very much what we have in an IT organization. We have written policies and Word documents. We have some indoctrination to make sure folks are exposed to those policies and aware of them. And then we have our compliance teams making sure that folks are following them, right? This is a lot of work, right? What if you could actually empower your developers and application teams to have full control, and your security team could still enforce all the rules that they needed to? But what if you could do that fully automated, right? What if instead of police officers having to manually check the speed of every car that drove by, we could automatically have the system do this, right? In the world of vehicles, that would be there's a technology called governors, right? So commercial fleets, they put these little chips inside a vehicle. It knows where the vehicle is. It knows the street by GPS, and it can actually enforce the vehicle speed limit. You cannot go over 35 or 55 or 65 in this area. It will not let the vehicle, right? We can apply that to our software delivery pipelines today. So what does that mean? Well, we're not enforcing speed limits, but we're enforcing things like required workloads. Are you running security scanning, DAS, SAS testing, vulnerability penetration testing? Are we depreciating risky versions or vulnerable versions across our organization? Are we encouraging standardization, best practices, consolidation, right? Enabling change management shifts or secrets management, right? These are all great opportunities that an organization can enforce policy for both existing and new project teams that they've never even heard of without any additional manual work or burden. What does that look like? Well, in this case, we have a rogue actor here who is trying to access production credentials by manipulating the credential context they're requesting access to. So they're running a dev deployment, they're running on a dev branch, and instead of requesting dev credentials, they're trying to get sneaky and request production credentials, right? This is a big problem for organization. They might be leaking those credentials. They might be exploiting those credentials. We're not sure what they're up to, but we know it's not good. Fortunately, our organization admins here were able to apply on top of the lovely Word doc that we have that outlines our policy. They were able to automate it with CircleCI's policy engine. So without getting lost in the syntax here, this basically says I have a rule that's called production context can only be used on main. It applies to this set of projects. And if ever a project violates this rule, I want you to hard fail that build, right? Well, why does that matter? Because if we think about the end-to-end system flow, in order for a change to reach CircleCI, it's been through a VCS system. Every major VCS today provides you the ability to do branch gating and merge checks. So we can say the only way to get on to that main branch, that default branch, is by peer reviews, approvals, like manager sign off, whatever it might be. And until they do that, you're not allowed to access production secrets. So basically, as a developer, you know what? You can do whatever you want because I know you're only operating in this isolated little blast area where you're not going to have access to credentials, systems, or services that could pose a risk to the organization. So go ahead, iterate to your heart's content. This developer violated that policy, though. They were trying to get sneaky. What happens? CircleCI will not even build it. We don't even entertain the conversation, right? We spit out an error to the developer in the UI that says, I'm sorry, here's a policy violation you had. You can customize that language, in this case, being really helpful to the application team, right? Here's the policy that we have. Here's the violation within your workflow, the specific job and context that are the problem. Go ahead and address this and we'll keep building for you. You'll see the right-hand side is kind of the commits in GitHub where I'm showing whether I'm trying to be sneaky or not. But as soon as the developer does something that's against policy, we block it. As soon as the developer is in line with policy, again, we allow it to build. And you can apply this without ever having to predefine that for projects. You do it at the organizational level. This, to me, is one of those exciting leap forwards. All right, enough of my vendor bias slides. As far as the POC goes itself, I mentioned we want to do a lot of work upfront to make sure folks are committed and aligned and ready to go, right? Well, we want to make sure we manage that commitment over the scope of the POC, right? It's a big deal and it's worth treating it as such. We want explicit goals and timelines. We want clear measures. We want named owners, right? And again, those named owners are representative of your user base, right? There's no secret meetings or readouts here. We're doing this openly. Anyone can see, this is an example of a team Jira board, right? So anyone in the company could see the team Jira board and what was being worked on and how that POC was going. Another one is just kind of a PDF they were sharing out at a regular interval. This is the overall status of this project and where we're at. That's important for the accountability and progress we need. Post POC rolling out, my biggest ask or thought around kind of the coming to the end of a POC is don't stop. Webinar 3 is all about day 2 operations, right? And so that's kind of ongoing management of a platform, and that's separate from where we're at today. But day 1, right, or day 0, we're just wrapping up that evaluation. We think it's a yes, and we want to move forward. This is a great opportunity to talk about it, start to build excitement and momentum within the organization. So when that larger change comes, they're ready for it and they're excited for it. Town hall, tech talks, IT forums, dev days, whatever your organization uses to get application teams talking, promote this stuff, right? Also use this as an opportunity to finalize any outstanding tasks, right? If there's that one integration you didn't get to, or secrets management needs to be cleaned up, or maybe some participant surveys or satisfaction surveys are still outstanding, go ahead and collect all that, wrap it up. Any outstanding documentation process stuff, tie that together. Around that process stuff, don't let your vendor off the hook. Yeah, they're waiting for you to sign that contract. You have their attention right now. So make sure that your folks, your subject matter experts, are getting to pair with their subject matter experts as things like implementation and design sessions are happening, so that you're building up that internal knowledge, right? They should be shadowing pretty every conversation that's happening at the organization, the classic train the trainer model. And then continue to encourage and recognize and celebrate teams. The celebration should never end, right? Anytime a new team gets on there, a new pattern, a new use case gets identified, promote that, celebrate that. It's a really exciting opportunity for the organization. Coming to a close here. Ultimately, what I hope that I've shared over the past 35 minutes or so was enterprise migrations aren't an airplane at all, and we don't want to change the engine mid-flight. Right. And in fact, it's risky and foolhardy to do so. Instead, we want to make sure that we're really thinking about how we scope and manage this migration and the POC to be successful, right? Messaging to our audience, creating that knowledge and desire. Is the pain of change greater than the pain of same? Is this an experience that is going to create excitement in our users that they're going to want to be present for? And are we using hard measures, objective measures to understand this is in fact the right thing for the business and it's the right time to execute on it? And we have people ready to go. Regardless of any tooling, as I mentioned a few times throughout this presentation, really focus on that knowledge and desire. Are we reducing the burden for knowledge, how hard it is for our folks to use this? And are we increasing their desire, their interest, what they're looking to achieve with this tooling? Because as leaders, tapping into that emotional aspect of our folks is one of the best ways that we can ensure success with any change management that we're looking to achieve. With that, I mentioned we had some time for questions at the end. We'll go ahead and slide into that. So if anyone has any additional questions, you can throw those into the Q&A box below, and we'll either speak to them online or we can follow up offline afterwards. All right. I do have one question here. Do you have any examples of companies that have done a CI/CD migration well? We do. Actually, I firstly would say I encourage folks to go out to our website, CircleCI.com, and there's a ton of great case studies that we've done with various customers and all sorts of organizations and industries. And so maybe you can find a customer that you feel kind of mirrors yourself in that case study list and see exactly how they went about this. But one example that came to my mind, kind of thinking about that patterns of consumption, was actually a large consulting organization. The unique challenge they had is that they had multiple different CI providers because they work with multiple different clients, and clients all had their own unique requirements. The challenge that's presented to the organization was, as they moved personnel from project to project, because projects were short-lived, there was a huge ramp-up burden to the individual employee, right? So when you transferred from project A to project B, they basically said it was 4 to 6 months before that contributor would be effective. What they also shared is many of their projects were 6 to 9 months, right? So there's a huge inefficiency there in how they're approaching their overall development, right? And so what I loved about that POC is from the start, they were approaching this at a systematic view. Our ramp up time versus their total duration, the math doesn't work out. We have a huge problem here. What we focused on in the POC was those patterns of consumption. And so we actually identified basically a collection of, for all the different project languages you use, here's this idea of a golden repository. This is the way your teams will build Golang applications for clients. This is the way your team will build Node.js applications or whatever the function is, and being able to support that across multiple cloud providers. Some cloud providers use AWS, GCP, Azure, etc. And so we're basically able to identify some CircleCI concepts, but a collection of orbs and templates in their repositories that teams could get started very quickly. They could clone a repository and they could be off and running with a particular language and a particular development environment that was suited to their client. That decreased the overall ramp-up time, but the other major benefit that had to those folks was, as those patterns got adopted more and more, the knowledge burden of each individual employee went down. Because now when you went from project A to project B, as long as they were both from those Golang repos, it was essentially the same process, and you could jump in much quicker. And just to wrap this point quickly, their goal was to get, I think, 2 teams and 3 projects into the POC over a month-long period. They hit that very quickly. By the end of the POC, which spanned 2 months, they had gotten, I think, over 5 teams and I want to say 20 or 30 projects in there. They just, it clicked for them, the idea of patterns of clone this and go, clone this and go, clone this and go, and using orbs that in the future, hey, if we want to change this, we can change it across everywhere all at once as teams are ready to, was so compelling to them that the teams themselves did that adoption within the scope of the POC. We were actually so pleased with their adoption. We gave them kind of a few weeks to hang out while we did the procurement work on the platform, full access, because we knew they were seeing the value, and we didn't want to stop that momentum from the team, right? And again, that's kind of the post POC. Let that excitement be the jam that really drives the automation, or the scale rather. And if folks have any other questions they want to drop in. And there's a few questions I've noted here that are a little low level. And so what we can do is just, for those folks, we can follow offline and kind of dive into the details around some specific scenarios here. If there's general concepts or topics that folks want to ask, I'll hang out for another minute or two. All right, it doesn't look like it. I really appreciate everyone's time today. I hope this conversation was useful for you. Please look out for webinar number 3 in our series, where we'll talk about day 2 operations. How do you maintain and scale a system beyond your POC? I look forward to that talk then. Thank you.